Missouri's withstood a number of tremendous natural disasters this spring. In fact, the floods that our good friend from Montana just talked about are headed down the Missouri River from Montana to the Dakotas to Missouri right now. We've had floods along the Mississippi. We've had floods of the Black River that required the evacuation of part of Poplar Bluff, Missouri. We've had tornadoes in both St. Louis and Joplin. And now, as I said, the Missouri River floods. The Missouri River is beginning to reflect what has happened upstream, the above normal snowpack that we don't see much of, but we see it when it melts in the spring. The flooding along the Missouri River, which is about to get to crisis stage, will now join floods along the Mississippi River, the Black River, and tornadoes in St. Louis and Joplin. River levels are expected to rise near record levels and remain there until early or mid-August. This, of course, will put a tremendous pressure on our levee system. The estimates that I heard this week were that between now and 2 weeks from today, there'll be at least 24 levees underwater, which means the water would have got high enough to come over the tops of those levees, and maybe over 50 levees on the Missouri River before it gets to St. Louis will be underwater, and we'll have water on both sides of them until well into the summer. And of course, that begins to undermine the very basis of the levee itself when it stands in water on both sides. The Corps and local sponsors are working to reinforce the levees along the Missouri River. We see that the Department of Agriculture and the Corps also has to get engaged to get the damaged land cleared and rehabilitated for all this levee protection to be restored. There's some discussion in the opening of the levee in the Boot Heel at a place called Bird's Point that had been the plan to open that levee in a flood disaster since 1937, but it hadn't happened since 1937. 130,000 additional acres of farmland means at this moment we probably have 500,000 acres of farmland, a little more than that, underwater, and that number will be much higher than that by this time next week. But that 130,000 acres at Bird's Point will still be underwater most of next year unless the Corps goes back in, as they committed they would, and gets a temporary levee that becomes a permanent levee in as soon as possible. We also, Mr. President, can't underestimate, and it would be hard to even overestimate, the challenges that Joplin, Missouri faces, a city that the death toll has now from a tornado has exceeded the death toll in any tornado in the last 50 years. I think mid-1950s was the last time this much loss of life occurred in a tornado. I live about 60 miles from Joplin in Springfield, Missouri, and I represented Joplin and Springfield both in the House of Representatives for 14 years. I had an office in Joplin. I was there. I've been there literally hundreds of times, and as a Southwest Missourian, I've seen lots of tornado damage, but I've never seen anything like this damage. I went to the area Tuesday after the tornado hit over the weekend. I think the tornado hit on Sunday afternoon late. I was there most of the day Tuesday. I was riding down streets with a veteran police sergeant that both he and I had been down many times, and neither of us could ever really tell quite where we were because the devastation was that great. Every street looked like the street right next to it. The buildings were ground up. The 2x4s had just become toothpicks. It was almost unrecognizable. This same tornado, if it would have hit and stayed on the ground for 6 miles in an area of farmland, would have done some damage, but there just wouldn't have been nearly as much damage. As it happened, it ripped through the city of Joplin in a swath that was at least a half a mile wide, and at some places 3/4 of a mile wide, stayed on the ground for 6 miles, and destroyed approximately 30% of the buildings in a town of 50,000 people. 141 people were killed, including those that have died in hospitals from injuries since the tornado because of the tornado. More than 900 people were injured. 8,000 homes and apartments were destroyed. And I think here the word destroyed is the right word. Others were damaged. These were destroyed. 8,000 places where people lived 3 weeks ago aren't there today, and more than 500 commercial properties were demolished by this devastating tornado. Homes, churches, the high school, the Votech school, 3 elementary schools, the Catholic school at all levels, all gone. And then other schools damaged. You know, how do you just get back to school in August and September of this year with those schools gone is a huge challenge, one that a community would assume it would never have to meet. But the community has been meeting it, as have people from all over the country and particularly from our state. Rescue efforts led by groups like Missouri Task Force 1 and other public safety officials, the fire departments, the law enforcement, the medical personnel, the volunteers have up till now been tireless, but I can tell you they're getting pretty tired. People in Missouri and across America have been overwhelmingly generous with their time and resources in the aftermath of this storm, and all Missourians are grateful for it. Large corporations and small community organizations and individuals have helped. FEMA's doing what they can do. We need to prioritize spending. As I reach the conclusion of my remarks and mention the people who needed to be mentioned, I sent President Obama a letter. I spoke with Secretary Napolitano shortly after this disaster, insisting that the federal government do what we did in Katrina and reimburse taxpayers for their expenses at the 100% level. We've gone from 75 to 90, so only 10% more, and I'll be happy with that number. 75% was the first number discussed, but we're at 90 now. The federal government needs to do this. Local utility companies need to get the same kind of assistance others have had in similar disasters. And in all cases, Mr. President, the first responders were people's neighbors. Their neighbors will still be there 6 months later when people are still struggling. But with thanks to everyone who has helped, with appreciation for the federal employees who have been there, and absolute insistence that we do everything we need to do to treat this disaster as it needs to be treated, because it truly is a disaster. And I'll be working with everything we can find to make this situation a challenge that the community can meet, and I would yield my time.